The kettle hadn't whistled yet, but I could already feel the house listening. Morning light leaned across the kitchen table, thin and pale, like it was tired of showing up. 3 coffee cups sat between us, steam rising gently, untouched. The clock over the sink ticked once, then again. I watched the light move across the wood grain, slow, careful, like it knew something I didn't. That's when my son cleared his throat. We had eaten at that table for most of our lives, birthdays with crooked candles, school mornings with crumbs everywhere, quiet Sundays when nobody said much but nobody had to. The table remembered all of it. I sat in my usual chair, the one closest to the window. The cushion dipped where my weight always landed. My hands rested in my lap, folded the way my mother taught me when I didn't know what else to do with them. My son sat across from me. He looked older than I remembered, not in his face, but in his posture. His shoulders sloped forward like he'd been carrying something heavy for a while. He stirred his coffee even though he hadn't taken a sip. The spoon clicked against the mug. Once, twice, again. My daughter sat beside him. She faced the window instead of me. Her hair fell forward when she leaned, hiding part of her face. She traced a small circle on the tabletop with her finger, over and over, as if she were trying to rub something away. No one spoke. The refrigerator hummed. The clock kept time. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires whispering against the road. I had lived long enough to know this kind of quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It was rehearsed. "Mom," my son said. His voice was gentle. It always was when he was about to say something hard. I looked up. He didn't meet my eyes right away. "We've been talking," he said. My daughter's fingers stopped moving. I nodded. I waited. He talked about small things first, appointments, the stairs, how the house felt too big now. He said we worry more than once, like that was meant to soften everything else. My daughter added a sentence here and there, still not looking at me. "We just want to make sure you're okay," she said. Her voice sounded tight, like she was holding it together with both hands. I listened. I always had. I'd learned long ago that listening kept the peace. After my husband died, I learned it even better. How to say "I'm fine" when my knees ached. How to move slower so no one had to wait for me. How to pretend I didn't hear things meant to be said quietly. My son took a breath. "So it doesn't all fall on us," he said. There was a pause. A small one. A burden. The word slipped out like it surprised him too. Burden. It landed on the table between the coffee cups, not loud, not sharp, just heavy. My daughter inhaled sharply and turned her head a fraction like she might pull the word back if she moved fast enough, but it was already there, sitting in the light. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly. My son nodded. "It's just a word, you know what I mean." I did. I folded my hands tighter in my lap. The skin on my knuckles felt thin, familiar. I didn't argue. I watched my son's face. His eyes were kind, worried. He looked like a boy again for a moment, the one who used to run inside with scraped knees expecting me to fix it. My daughter stared at the table. She didn't look at me. They explained after that, carefully, like you explain something delicate you don't want to break. How things had changed, how I needed more help, how it wasn't fair to anyone. The house seemed to shrink with every sentence. The walls leaned closer, the ceiling pressed down a bit more. Even the light felt different, dimmer, like it wanted to slip away. I thought about the years I'd carried them, on my hip, on my back, through fevers and heartbreaks and days they didn't remember anymore. No one ever called that a burden. I wondered when the word had started living in their mouths, how long it had waited. When they finished, the room went still again. My son looked at me then, finally. He was waiting. My daughter kept her eyes on the table. I could have said something. I could have reminded them of everything I'd been, everything I still was. Instead, I nodded. "If that's how you feel," I said. My voice sounded steady. I hadn't planned that. Relief passed over my son's face, quick, almost guilty. My daughter let out a breath she'd been holding, her shoulders dropping slightly. They thought the hardest part was over. They didn't see what settled inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness, not exactly. It was understanding. I understood then that this conversation hadn't started that morning. It had been happening without me for a while, in phone calls, in car rides, in quiet decisions made with good intentions and no room for my voice. I wondered how many times my name had been said when I wasn't there, how many times it had been followed by a sigh. I wondered how long they thought I hadn't noticed the way I was spoken to now, softer, slower, like I might break. They left the table one by one. The coffee was still untouched. I stayed where I was. The light shifted across the floor, inch by inch, patient and unbothered. I ran my fingers along the edge of the table, feeling the small scratches left behind by years of living. The house creaked softly, like it remembered me. I let the word rest where it had fallen. Burden. I didn't pick it up. I didn't carry it. I just sat there, listening to the quiet, wondering when they had started talking about me like this, and how long they thought I hadn't been listening. The hallway light stayed off longer than it used to. I noticed that first. Doors closed softly now, like they were learning how to disappear without making a sound. When I walked past, the floorboards creaked the way they always had, but no one answered them anymore. The house still breathed, heat clicking on, pipes ticking awake, yet something had gone quiet inside it. Not empty, just careful. I stood in the doorway listening to a room that had already decided I wasn't part of it. After that morning at the table, the days began to blur at the edges. Nothing dramatic changed, no arguments, no slammed doors, just small adjustments, the kind you almost miss if you're not paying attention. My daughter started closing her bedroom door while she talked on the phone. My son took calls outside, even when it was cold. Conversations paused when I entered the kitchen, then picked up again once I moved on. Voices lowered like they were afraid of waking something, or someone. I told myself it was nothing. People get busy, houses get quiet. Still, I found myself walking slower, giving them time to finish their sentences before I arrived. I learned where to pause, how to turn back if I heard laughter that didn't include me. In the afternoons, I sat by the window in the living room. The chair there had a dip that fit me just right, like it had been waiting. Light poured in through the glass, thick and warm, catching dust as it drifted. The particles moved slowly, floating without purpose, like they didn't belong anywhere else. I watched them for a long time. Outside, the yard stayed the same, grass growing where it always had, fence leaning just enough to look tired. Nothing had been erased out there. Inside was different. One afternoon, I heard my name. It came from the kitchen, soft and unfinished, my daughter's voice, my son's right after. I stood still in the hallway, one hand resting against the wall. The paint felt cool beneath my fingers. "She doesn't have to know everything," my daughter said. My son answered, but I couldn't hear the words, just the tone, low, careful. I waited. Silence followed, thick and sudden. Then footsteps, a chair scraping back. I stepped forward then, letting the floor creak on purpose, announcing myself the way I'd learned to. They looked up too quickly. "Oh, Mom," my daughter said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We were just talking." I nodded. "About dinner?" I asked. "Yes," she said, too fast. "Dinner." The room smelled like soup, the kind I'd taught her to make years ago when she couldn't boil water without asking me how. It still smelled right. Onions, salt. Something simmered too long because no one wanted to turn it off. I moved past them, opened the cabinet, took out a bowl. My hands shook just enough to notice. They didn't speak again until I left the room. It happened like that for weeks. Voices lowered, doors closed, my name used less, replaced with she and her, words that floated around me without landing. I began to feel like a guest in my own house, a polite one, quiet, easy to step around. I stopped asking questions. When mail arrived, I stacked it neatly and didn't look too closely. When papers lay on the counter, I didn't read them. I learned where not to sit so I wouldn't interrupt anything important. I watched instead. The way my daughter avoided my eyes when she talked about plans. The way my sons sighed before answering even simple questions. The way they spoke kindly but briefly, like kindness had a time limit now. One afternoon, I stood in my bedroom doorway and realized something had changed there, too. A box sat on the floor, not packed exactly, but started. Old sweaters folded carefully, shoes I hadn't worn in years. I didn't ask who played there. I sat on the bed and pressed my palm into the quilt. The fabric felt thin in places, worn by years of use. I remembered stitching parts of it at night, back when everyone was asleep and the house still felt full. The walls didn't echo anymore. They absorbed sound instead. That's when it came to me, slow and unwelcome. I hadn't been pushed out. I'd been faded. Erasure doesn't make noise. It doesn't argue. It doesn't announce itself. It happens in pauses, in doors half closed, in conversations moved to other rooms. It happens when your presence becomes something people plan around instead of plan with. I sat by the window again, afternoon light settling across my hands. Dust drifted lazily through it, catching and releasing the sun like it didn't care how long it took to fall. I wondered how long I'd been disappearing. Maybe it started when I stopped driving at night, or when I forgot a name once and laughed it off so no one would worry. Maybe it started when they realized they could decide things faster without me slowing them down. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Tired of pretending I didn't hear the whispers. Tired of shrinking so others could stretch out. Tired of being present in a house that had already begun to live without my voice. I thought about saying something, standing in the kitchen and asking them to stop lowering their voices, but I knew what would happen. They would smile, reassure me, tell me everything was fine, and the doors would still close. That evening I watched the sun slip behind the fence, shadows stretching across the floor like long fingers. The house filled with familiar smells, soup, wood, the faint sweetness of laundry soap. Everything I loved was still there, just quieter. I stayed by the window until the light faded completely. The dust settled. The room dimmed. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. I didn't follow the sound. I sat still, listening to the spaces between things, wondering how you stay present in a place where you've already been erased, and whether the house remembered me, even if the people inside it no longer did. The mail had been sitting there all afternoon. I knew because the light had moved across it twice, first in a thin stripe, just touching the corner of an envelope, then later, wider, heavier, like it meant to stay. I stood at the edge of the table, listening to the house settle into evening. Somewhere a clock ticked. The refrigerator sighed. Nothing felt urgent. That's when I saw the folder. Manila, slightly bent at the corner. My name written across it. Careful, neat, like it mattered. The kitchen was quiet in that way it gets right before night. Not peaceful, just paused. Dinner had already been eaten. The sink was clean. Someone had wiped the counters but missed a small spot near the edge, a faint circle where a glass had rested too long. The folder was tucked beneath a stack of mail, half hidden but not quite, like it didn't know whether it wanted to be found. I hadn't gone looking for anything. I only meant to throw away the flyers and bring the rest to my room. That was my routine now. Stay useful, stay out of the way. I slid the mail aside slowly. My name looked strange written there by someone else's hand, first and last. No nickname, no mom, just ink, steady and sure. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, recognition. The chair scraped softly as I sat down. The sound felt louder than it should have, like the house was paying attention again. I rested my hands on the table and waited a moment before touching the folder. I told myself there was probably nothing inside that concerned me. Bills, maybe. Records. Things grown children handle when they think they're being helpful. Still, my fingers hesitated. The folder opened easily. Too easily. Inside were papers I didn't recognize. Typed pages. Letterhead. Dates circled in pen. Signatures that weren't mine. I read slowly. I'd learned to do that. Not because I couldn't read fast, but because fast reading makes people nervous. Slow reading looks harmless. There were forms about the house, about care, about arrangements. Words like transition and temporary appeared more than once, phrases that sounded gentle until you looked at them too closely. I turned a page, then another. Each one felt heavier than the last. They had planned carefully, I could see that. Everything was organized, thought through, even kind in its own way. No rough edges, no cruelty, just absence. My voice was missing from every page. I imagined them sitting together somewhere, at this same table maybe, discussing these things while I was in the next room, or asleep, or watching dust drift through sunlight, thinking I was still part of the house. I wondered who suggested the folder, who wrote my name so neatly across the front, who decided this was the right thing to do. My hands trembled then, just a little, enough that the paper rustled when I turned another page. I stopped reading when I reached a line that mentioned consent. Not mine, someone else's. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the kitchen. The walls were the same, the cabinets, the small crack near the doorway where the paint had chipped years ago. I remembered meaning to fix it. I remembered deciding it could wait. The house still smelled like soup and old wood, comforting things, familiar things. But the air felt different, thinner. I thought about all the choices I'd made quietly over the years, the ones no one noticed because they worked, the times I put my own wants aside because someone else needed something more. I thought about how easily that pattern could be misunderstood for permission. I closed the folder. The sound was soft, final. For a moment I considered keeping it, taking it with me, asking questions out loud instead of only in my head. Instead, I slid it back beneath the mail, lined it up just the way it had been, made sure the edge didn't stick out. My hands shook again as I stood. This time, I didn't try to hide it. I realized then how much had already been decided, how many steps had been taken without me, how neatly my life could be rearranged while I was still walking through it. No one had asked what I wanted. Maybe they thought they already knew. That night I lay awake listening to the house breathe. Pipes knocking, a door closing somewhere down the hall, footsteps, careful, like someone didn't want to wake me. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint shadow where the fan used to be. We'd taken it down years ago, another small decision, another thing that changed without much discussion. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have required energy. What I felt instead was a slow, settling clarity, like dust finally landing after floating all day. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to manage me. There's a difference. Management doesn't ask questions. It makes plans. It assumes cooperation.
It uses quiet words and tidy folders. I wondered how many more folders there were, how many decisions already written down, how many versions of my future existed without me knowing. I wondered how much time I still had to speak. The next morning, the mail was gone. The table was clear. Sunlight poured in like nothing had happened. I made myself tea and sat in my chair, holding the warm cup between my palms. The house moved around me, familiar sounds, familiar smells, all of it unchanged on the surface. But I knew now. Somewhere in this house, my life was being folded neatly into plans I hadn't seen, decisions made kindly, quietly, without my voice. I took a slow sip of tea and watched the steam rise, disappear. And I wondered, not for the first time, what else had they decided while I was still breathing?
The boxes arrived before the conversation did. Clean, folded flat, leaning against the wall like they'd always belonged there. I stood in the doorway of my room and listened to the house wake up. Pipes knocking softly, a door opening somewhere down the hall, morning light pressed against the curtains, asking to come in. No one had said today out loud, but the boxes knew. They told me it would be temporary, just until things were easier. A smaller room, fewer stairs, less to worry about. They said it gently, the way you speak to someone who might scare easily. My son used his careful voice. My daughter stood too close, like she was afraid I might fall before I said yes. I nodded. I had learned that nodding kept things calm. My room still looked the same that morning. The dresser by the window, the chair with the loose leg I never fixed, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the one I'd sewn years ago, back when I still stayed up late without feeling it the next day. I opened the top drawer first. That felt right. Inside were things no one ever asks about: old letters, a brooch with a bent pin, a pair of gloves I hadn't worn in years but couldn't throw away. I touched each one before deciding. Some went into the box, some went back into the drawer. I packed slowly, not because I was tired, because I was saying goodbye to things that had never been given a proper ending. The house moved around me while I packed. Footsteps past my door, a laugh from the kitchen, the low murmur of a phone call cut short when someone noticed me watching. No one came in. I wrapped a framed photo in newspaper, my husband standing in the yard, squinting into the sun. I remembered the day it was taken. He'd complained about the light. I told him to stop moving. I smiled at that. The box filled quickly, too quickly. I realized then how little of my life fit into cardboard, how much of it was stitched into walls and floorboards, and the quiet routines of living somewhere long enough to disappear into it. I left some things behind on purpose: a chipped mug, the heavy coat in the hall closet, the stack of recipes tucked into a drawer no one ever opened. No one noticed. My daughter appeared once, standing in the doorway. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She nodded, relieved. "Let us know if you need help." I didn't. She left before I could say anything else. The hardest part wasn't packing. It was deciding what not to take. There were things I'd owned longer than my children had been alive. A small table by the window, a lamp with a pole chain that clicked just right, a pair of gloves I hadn't worn in years but couldn't throw away. I sat on the bed and looked around the room. The walls still held the faint marks where pictures had hung and been moved, then hung again. The floor creaked in familiar places. Even the air felt known. This room had watched me age quietly. It had held me when no one else was awake. It had never asked me to explain myself. I closed the last box and taped it shut. The sound echoed. When my son came in, he lifted the box without comment, like it was just another thing to move, like it didn't carry years inside it. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded again. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced back once. Just once. The room looked smaller already, less certain, like it was waiting to forget me. No one noticed that look either. The new room was clean, efficient, quiet in a different way. The bed was narrower, the window faced the wrong direction. Light came in late, if at all. They set my boxes down neatly, promised to come back later, asked if I needed anything. I said no. When they left, the door clicked shut behind them, a gentle sound, final. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The house I'd moved into wasn't unkind, it just didn't know me. The walls didn't remember my hands, the floor didn't creak in recognition. I unpacked only what I needed. The rest stayed in their boxes. That night I lay awake staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, tracing cracks that hadn't been earned yet. I thought about all the things I'd left behind without ceremony. I wondered if leaving quietly made it easier for them. Easier not to feel guilty, easier to move on. I wondered if silence helped people forget. In the morning, I folded my blanket and placed it carefully at the foot of the bed, habit more than need. Sunlight found its way in through the narrow window, thin and cautious. Dust floated through it, settling slowly. I sat in the chair by the wall, not mine but given, and listened to the building breathe. Somewhere far away, a door closed. A voice laughed. Life continued without adjusting its volume for me. I held my hands together and waited for the room to learn me. And as the quiet settled in, I wondered, softly without accusation, if leaving quietly made it easier for them to forget me, or if it had already begun long before I packed the first box. The window only opened a few inches, just enough to let in air, not enough to let anything out. I stood there the first night, fingers resting on the latch, feeling the cool glass beneath my skin. Outside, the dark pressed close, quiet and unfamiliar. Inside, the room waited, clean, still, watching. When I let go of the window, it slid back into place on its own, like it preferred things closed. The new place was everything they promised: efficient, orderly, safe. White walls, neutral carpet, furniture chosen for ease, not memory. Nothing creaked when I walked, nothing answered back. During the day, it almost felt kind. Light filled the room evenly, without shadows. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something floral I couldn't name. People passed in the hallway outside my door, footsteps soft, voices low and distant. At night, it changed. I lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The light fixture hummed faintly, even when it was turned off, like it hadn't learned how to sleep yet. Somewhere behind the walls, pipes knocked and sighed, a rhythm I didn't recognize. They sounded like strangers whispering to each other. I missed the old house most at night. The way the floorboards used to announce me before I entered a room, the way the stairs complained in their own familiar order, the way the house spoke back when I moved through it, reminding me I was still there. Here, my steps disappeared. The second night, I tried walking the room, just to see if it would respond. I took slow steps from the bed to the door, then back again. My slippers made no sound on the carpet. The walls stayed quiet. The ceiling didn't shift. Even the door opened and closed without protest. I stopped in the middle of the room and stood very still. Nothing noticed. In the old house, the walls had known me. They held the marks where pictures once hung, where hands brushed past too many times. They remembered laughter and arguments and the nights I cried quietly so no one would hear. This place had no memory of me. I sat in the chair by the window, not mine, but assigned, and rested my hands on my knees. The fabric felt stiff, new, unworn by habit. Outside, a streetlight flickered. Inside, the room hummed softly, steady and impersonal. I thought about how long it takes for a space to learn someone. How many mornings, how many nights. I wondered if this one ever would. Sleep came in pieces. I drifted off for a moment, then woke again when the pipes knocked sharply, like someone rapping on the wall and stopping just before being answered. My heart raced before my mind caught up. I listened. The sound faded. I thought of the old house again, how it used to settle at night, a long exhale after everyone was asleep. The way it shifted and creaked, letting me know I wasn't alone, even when I felt like I was. I remembered walking down the hallway in the dark, knowing exactly where the floor would dip, where the board would complain. The house had learned my steps the way I learned its moods. Love leaves marks like that. I turned onto my side and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The fabric smelled unfamiliar. Not bad, just not mine. That's when the thought came, quiet but clear. Even buildings remember who loved them first. I wondered if the old house still felt me there, if the walls noticed my absence, if the floorboards still waited for my weight. And then, without meaning to, I wondered something harder. Did anyone else remember me that way? The days passed gently. Meals arrived on time, people knocked before entering, smiles were polite and practiced. Everyone knew my name here. It was printed on a card by the door, easy to read, easy to replace. I unpacked slowly, choosing what to display and what to keep tucked away. The quilt went over the chair. The photo of my husband sat on the small table by the bed. I watched how the room reacted. It didn't. No shift, no sound, no sign of recognition. I realized then that memory isn't automatic. It's built, earned, pressed into places over time. I had spent years building myself into a house that no longer held me, years being present in rooms that now closed their doors softly behind me. This place would never know me the way the old one did, and maybe that was the point. Efficiency leaves no room for ghosts. I wondered if my children slept better knowing I was somewhere quiet, somewhere predictable, somewhere that didn't creak or complain. I wondered if they thought of me at night. On the fourth night, I stood by the window again. The latch stopped me at the same place as before. I rested my forehead against the glass, cool and steady. Outside, someone laughed. A car passed. Life continued, full and loud enough to reach me only in pieces. Inside, the walls stayed silent. I turned back to the room and sat on the bed, smoothing the blanket the way I always had. Habit travels with you, even when home does not. As I lay down, the pipes hummed once more. Not unkindly, just unfamiliar. I closed my eyes and listened, trying to learn the language of this place. And in the quiet, I asked myself, softly, honestly, if anyone remembered me the way the old walls did, or if memory, like love, had already moved on without saying goodbye. The envelope wasn't meant for me. I could tell by the way it hesitated in my hands. Thin paper, official weight, my address typed neatly, like it had been pulled from a place that hadn't been checked in a while. The mail cart rattled away down the hall, leaving me alone with it. I stood by the door for a long moment, listening to the hum of the building. Then I opened it. Mail arrives differently here. At a certain hour, in small stacks, names read aloud softly, as if volume might disturb something fragile. Most days, it's reminders, notices, things meant to keep life moving in straight lines. This envelope was different. Inside was a folded letter and a copy of a ledger page, pale, almost yellow, like it had lived a long time before reaching me. The ink had faded in places. The edges were worn, handled by more hands than mine. I sat at the small table by the window and smoothed the page flat. There, near the top, was my name. Not scribbled, not corrected, written clearly, confidently. Primary. I hadn't seen my name placed like that in a long time. I traced the letters with my finger, slowly, like they might disappear if I moved too fast. The ink felt raised beneath my skin, pressed deep enough to last. Someone, somewhere, had forgotten to erase me. I read the letter twice before the words settled. It was an apology, brief, procedural, an error in records, a delay in updating information, nothing personal. They hadn't meant to send it to me, that much was clear. But the ledger page stayed open on the table, refusing to be folded back into explanation. Dates lined the margins, names crossed out, replaced. Small notes written in cramped handwriting, correcting the past, one careful stroke at a time. My name remained untouched. I imagined the ledger sitting on a shelf somewhere, heavy and quiet. I imagined someone flipping through it quickly, looking for what they needed, never noticing what they left behind. Or noticing and deciding it didn't matter. The warmth in my chest surprised me. It wasn't pride, it wasn't triumph, it was recognition. Proof that somewhere, in some version of the story, I still existed as I had been, not reduced, not softened, not managed, just named. I leaned back in my chair and let the paper rest in my lap. For weeks I had felt myself thinning, becoming easier to overlook, my life condensed into schedules and accommodations, my presence measured by convenience. This small mistake felt like a hand reaching back through time. I thought about all the places where records live, filing cabinets, computer systems, notebooks kept out of habit more than necessity. I wondered how many of them still carried my name the way it used to be. I wondered how many people relied on those records to decide who mattered. The truth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it leaves marks in the margins, ink that lingers because no one thought to erase it. I folded the ledger page carefully and placed it back in the envelope. My hands were steady now. For the first time in weeks, I felt tall again, not in body, that had not changed, but in presence, in weight. I hadn't disappeared as completely as I'd been led to believe. That afternoon, I took a walk down the hall, slowly, deliberately. People nodded as I passed. Some smiled, some didn't look up. All of it felt different now, filtered through the knowledge that erasure isn't always thorough. I returned to my room and placed the envelope in the drawer beside my bed, not hidden, just kept. I sat there for a while, listening to the building settle around me, pipes knocking, a cart rolling, a door opening and closing somewhere nearby, all the small sounds of a place that functions without asking who it leaves behind. I thought about the decisions made without my voice, the plans folded neatly around my absence, the way kindness can still wound when it doesn't ask permission. And I thought about the ledger again. How many other names lingered there untouched? How many stories refused to be fully rewritten? Mistakes tell the truth sometimes. That night, before turning off the light, I opened the drawer once more. I took out the envelope and held it against my chest for a moment. The paper was cool, solid. Then I put it back. The room hummed softly, familiar now in its own way. Outside, a light flickered. Inside, the walls stayed quiet. I lay down and closed my eyes, my finger still remembering the shape of my name in ink. Someone had forgotten to erase me completely. And as sleep found me, gentle and unhurried, I wondered how many other marks had been missed, and what might happen if I started looking for them.
The first question I asked sounded like nothing at all. Just a pause. A small, "Do you remember?" said gently enough to be ignored. We were standing near the window, the afternoon light falling in uneven stripes across the floor. I asked it the way you ask about the weather, not expecting an answer. But the room shifted. Not much. just enough to tell me the past had been listening. I hadn't planned on asking questions. It began as something else, a feeling that wouldn't settle, a sense that pieces of my life were scattered in places I no longer visited. I started with neighbors, the kind who still remember where they were when certain things happened. I called them under the excuse of checking in, my voice warm, unhurried. "How long has it been?" I'd say. "Do you still live near the old place?" They spoke carefully at first, then more easily. People do that when they think you're calling for comfort instead of clarity. Old friends came next, the ones whose numbers I still had written down instead of saved. We talked about weather, about aches, about names that no longer needed last names. And then, gently, I asked. People are generous with memory when they believe it costs them nothing. I learned quickly which questions opened doors, not why, but when, not who decided, but how did it happen. I asked about the years after my husband died, about the help I'd offered, the rides I'd given, the nights I stayed up when someone else couldn't. "Oh, you always handled that," one neighbor said, laughing softly. "I don't know how you did it." Another paused. "You were the one who made sure things didn't fall apart." The words weren't new, but hearing them spoken out loud, recorded nowhere but memory, felt different now. I asked at offices too, quietly, politely, the way an old woman asks so she won't be rushed. "I'm trying to understand," I'd say. "Could you explain this to me?" They did. They explained records, transitions, updates that hadn't been completed because someone else usually handled that. They spoke freely when they thought I didn't know enough to challenge them. Dates emerged, names, patterns. I wrote nothing down. I just listened. Turning point. One afternoon, I sat with a friend I hadn't seen in years. We shared tea that had gone lukewarm while we talked. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "You know," she said slowly, "you gave more than anyone ever noticed." I didn't answer. She continued, "You made it look easy, like it didn't cost you anything." That stayed with me. I realized then how much of my life existed outside of paperwork, how much I'd done without receipts, without signatures, without witnesses who thought it mattered. Kindness doesn't ask to be recorded, it assumes it will be remembered. But memory fades, and when it does, kindness becomes invisible. I saw it clearly now, how easily my contributions had been mistaken for availability, how often "she'll handle it" turned into "it was never really hers." Nothing I'd given was written down, which meant it could be rewritten. I stopped asking questions after that, not because I had enough answers, but because I understood the shape of the truth. It wasn't hidden, it just wasn't documented. I walked back to my room that evening with a strange calm settling over me. The building hummed. The hallway lights flickered on, one by one. I thought about the ledger again, my name still there, untouched, a mistake that told the truth. I thought about all the other ledgers that didn't exist, the hours, the sacrifices, the quiet choices made without applause. There would be no paper trail for those, but they had still happened, and I was still here. I sat by the window and watched dusk arrive slowly, like it wasn't sure I was worth rushing for. I felt something steady rise in me, not anger, not grief, resolve. That night, I folded the envelope with my name in it and placed it back in the drawer. I didn't need to prove anything yet. I just needed to remember. The past speaks softly if you let it. It doesn't demand attention. It waits for the right questions, asked the right way. As I lay down, the room quiet around me, I thought about all the kindness I'd given that left no record behind. And I wondered, what happens when something true has no paper trail? And what happens next when someone finally decides to speak it out loud? The rain started after dark. Not hard, just enough to be noticed. It tapped against the glass in small, careful rhythms, like someone trying not to interrupt. I sat by the window with the light off, watching the reflections shift and blur, the world outside folding itself into water and shadow. That was when I learned about the meeting. Not from an invitation, not from a conversation meant for me, from a sentence that slipped out by accident and landed heavier than the rain. Evenings have a way of loosening things. People speak more freely when they're tired, when they think the day is already finished. My daughter had called to check in. Her voice sounded distracted, pulled thin by other things happening around her. I could hear papers moving, a chair scraping, someone else breathing nearby. We talked about small things, the weather, dinner, whether I was sleeping well. Then she said it. "We went over everything again today," she said. "We?" There was a pause, a quiet one. "The lawyer," she added, "and your brother helped too." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I pictured a table I wasn't sitting at. Coffee cups, files opened neatly, my name printed at the top of pages I'd never seen. They talked about my life the way you talk about furniture, where it fits best, how to move it without damaging anything important. I said nothing. After we hung up, the room felt colder. The rain pressed closer to the window, its tapping more insistent now, like it had something to add. I replayed the word meeting in my head. Meeting meant planning, decision, agreement. It meant voices layered over mine. I imagined them sitting together, my children, a lawyer with tidy hands, maybe someone from an office who smiled too much. I imagined how my life sounded when reduced to bullet points. Needs, costs, logistics. I wondered if they used my name or if they spoke around it. She'll be fine. She won't mind. This is best. Efficiency wears a pleasant face. It speaks calmly. It never raises its voice. But it moves quickly. I sat back in my chair and listened to the rain. It ran down the glass in thin lines, crossing and separating, never staying still long enough to be followed. I thought about how many meetings I'd attended for others, school conferences, doctor visits, long afternoons spent asking questions so someone else wouldn't have to. I thought about how often I'd spoken for people who were too tired or scared to speak themselves. Now my life was being spoken about without me. What hurt wasn't the planning, it was the assumption, the certainty that I would agree if I were there, that my silence meant consent, that efficiency was kindness enough. They hadn't meant to be cruel, that much I knew. They were trying to make things smoother, easier, quieter, trying to remove obstacles. They hadn't realized the obstacle was me. I stood and walked to the window, resting my hand against the cool glass. The rain blurred my reflection until I barely recognized myself. I began rehearsing words then, quietly, carefully. I would like to be included. I want to understand. Please don't decide my life without asking me. The words sounded strange out loud, even in a whisper, like they belonged to someone braver. I tried again. I'm still here. That one stuck. I imagined saying it at that table, the way conversation might stall, the way papers would stop moving, how silence would stretch, uncomfortable and exposed. I wondered if they would listen or if they'd smile gently and explain why it was already too late. Efficiency doesn't like interruption. I returned to my chair and let the rain finish what it had started. It slowed, softened, then settled into a steady hush. The room felt small but honest, no one else breathing here, no plans being made without me. I realized something then, something simple and sharp. They hadn't stopped seeing me as a person, they'd started seeing me as a problem to be solved. Problems are discussed in meetings, solutions are chosen quickly. People are messier. I thought about the words I hadn't said yet, how heavy they felt in my chest, waiting, how long they'd been there, building weight every time I chose peace over presence. Maybe silence had been easier, maybe that's why it lasted so long. But ease has a cost, and I was paying it. The rain stopped sometime after midnight. The world outside went still, rinsed clean of motion. I turned the lamp back on and sat at the small table, hands folded, just like that morning long ago in the kitchen. The position felt familiar, too familiar. I didn't speak the words yet, but I held them carefully, like something fragile I intended to keep. Somewhere there would be another meeting, another conversation I might or might not be invited to. This time I knew what I would ask for. I listened to the quiet room, the walls holding their breath with me, and wondered, if I finally spoke, would they listen? Or would efficiency once again speak louder than I ever had? The envelope arrived without ceremony. No raised voices, no warning. It sat on the edge of the table while morning light crept in, thin and unsure, like it didn't want to draw attention to itself. I noticed it only because it was heavier than the rest, thicker, official in a way that made the room feel suddenly alert. I didn't open it right away. I made my tea first, let the kettle boil, let the house wake up. Truth, I had learned, rarely knocks, it waits to be noticed. By then, I had grown used to being careful with paper. Letters had a way of carrying more than words. They carried intent, authority, decisions made elsewhere. I sat at the table with my cup warming my hands and studied the envelope. My name was typed neatly on the front, not softened, not abbreviated, just my name. That alone felt like something. The room was quiet, too quiet for early morning. Somewhere down the hall, someone coughed, a door closed gently. Life moved on, but slowly, like it didn't want to interrupt what was about to happen. When I finally opened the envelope, the sound of tearing paper felt louder than it should have. Final. Inside was a single document, clean, revised, dates updated, language precise. My name appeared where it hadn't before, where it should have been all along. I read the document once without understanding it, then again more slowly. There it was, a correction, an amendment, a signature added back in, neat and careful, like someone had practiced it before committing to the page. They hadn't announced it, they hadn't explained it, they had simply fixed it. A small paragraph near the bottom acknowledged an oversight, administrative, unintentional, regrettable. No one said sorry, but the truth had arrived anyway. I felt it before I named it, a loosening in my chest, like something unknotted itself without asking permission. My hands didn't shake this time. They stayed steady on the table, fingers resting on the paper like they had every right to be there. I thought about all the times I'd been told things were already handled, already decided, nothing to worry about. This worried about me. That mattered more than I expected. They came by later that afternoon. My daughter stood just inside the doorway, the way she does when she's unsure whether to step forward or back. My son hovered behind her, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight. They looked at the document on the table before they looked at me. "Well," my daughter said softly. No one smiled. My son nodded once, quick and small, like he was acknowledging a fact he couldn't undo. "It's been corrected," he said. I waited. Neither of them met my eyes right away. They stood there like children caught rewriting something they weren't supposed to touch, embarrassed, quiet. "I should have caught it sooner," my daughter added. "We both should have." I folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "It's done," I said. The words surprised all of us. They expected anger or relief or gratitude. What they got was calm. They lingered for a moment, unsure what else was required of them. There was no celebration, no hug, no dramatic turning point, just the uncomfortable space that opens when the truth finally sits where it belongs. I realized then that apologies don't always come with words. Sometimes they arrive as revisions, as signatures added back in where they were erased. Sometimes they arrive late. After they left, I sat alone again. The document rested in the drawer beside my bed, no longer hidden, no longer needed for proof, just there. I thought about how small the correction had been on paper, a line restored, a name returned, no fireworks, no speeches, and yet it shifted something. I felt heavier in the room, more solid, like the walls noticed me again. The truth doesn't always ask for forgiveness. Sometimes it only insists on accuracy. I wondered if this was enough. Enough to make up for the meetings I wasn't invited to, the decisions made without my voice, the months of being spoken around instead of spoken with. Probably not, but it was something. And something, after so much quiet, felt almost like abundance. That evening, I placed the document back in its envelope and slid it into the drawer, not because I needed to hide it, but because I didn't need to hold it anymore. Outside, the sky darkened slowly, taking its time. Inside, the room settled, familiar in its sounds and shadows. I sat by the window and watched the light fade from the walls, noticing how they held it just a little longer than before. My name had returned to places it had never truly left. No one applauded, no one apologized out loud. But the truth had arrived, and as the quiet wrapped itself around me again, gentle and unchanged, I wondered, was the truth enough, even when it came without an apology? Or was this only the beginning of learning how to be seen again?
They stood in the doorway longer than necessary, not coming in, not leaving. The light behind them stretched their shadows across the floor, thin and unsure, like they didn't quite belong to anyone yet. I stayed seated by the window, hands folded, watching dust lift and fall in the late afternoon sun. No one spoke at first. Then my son said my name, not loudly, not confidently, like he was testing whether it still worked. They hadn't told me they were coming. I think that mattered. It meant this visit hadn't been planned the way other things were. No agenda, no papers tucked under arms. Just them, uncertain, slightly out of place. My daughter hovered near the chair across from me, but didn't sit right away. She kept smoothing her coat, even though it didn't need it. My son stood by the door, then moved to the wall, then back again, like he couldn't find the right distance. I watched them quietly. It was strange seeing them like this, grown, careful, stripped of the certainty they'd worn so easily before. The room felt different with them in it, smaller, charged. "Hi, Mom," my son said again. He said my name slowly this time, clearly. I nodded. "Hello." The words settled between us. My daughter finally sat. My son followed. The chairs creaked under their weight, a sound that surprised all of us. We hadn't expected the room to answer back. For a moment, none of us knew what to do with our hands. My daughter was the first to break. She didn't speak. She just leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and pressed her face to her hands. Her shoulders shook once, then again. I watched her cry without explaining why. No words, no apologies, just the quiet sound of breath breaking. My son stared at the floor. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his sleeve, the way he used to when he was nervous as a boy. He cleared his throat, then stopped. "Mom," he said again. I waited. "I just wanted to check on you," he said. I nodded. "I'm all right." It was true, or true enough. My daughter lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. She didn't look at me right away. When she did, her face folded slightly, like she was seeing something she hadn't meant to miss. "I didn't realize," she said softly. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They waited then. For anger, for a list, for the accounting of everything they'd overlooked. I gave them none of it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind them of meetings I hadn't attended or decisions I hadn't agreed to. I didn't speak about folders or signatures or quiet erasures. I only looked at them. I let them sit with the weight of that. My son shifted uncomfortably. "We thought we were helping," he said. "I know," I answered. That seemed to surprise him. My daughter swallowed. "I didn't think you noticed," she said. I held her gaze. "I notice," I said. Silence followed. Not the careful silence from before, the kind meant to avoid discomfort. This one stayed. It waited. It asked something of them. They looked at me differently then, not as a problem to be solved, not as a responsibility to manage, as a person. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive all at once. It moved slowly across their faces, like light shifting in a room. Recognition. We sat that way for a long time. My daughter reached for my hand, hesitated, then rested her fingers lightly against mine. My skin felt thin beneath her touch, familiar, real. "I'm sorry," she said finally. The words were quiet, imperfect, late, but they were hers. My son nodded. "I should have said your name more," he said. "I should have listened." I didn't answer right away. I watched the dust move through the light. I listened to the room hold us all. "I don't need you to fix anything," I said at last. "I just need you to see me." They did then. Not completely, not forever, but enough to matter. I realized something in that moment, something small but steady. Justice doesn't always come with raised voices or clear victories. Sometimes it arrives as recognition, as someone finally meeting your eyes and staying there. Sometimes being seen is the reckoning. When they left, they hugged me carefully, like they were afraid of breaking something fragile. I let them. After the door closed, the room felt quiet again, but not empty. I returned to my chair by the window and sat down, folding my hands the way I always had. Outside, the light shifted toward evening, slow and forgiving. They had spoken my name. They had looked at me. They had stayed. It wasn't everything, but it was something I'd been missing longer than I realized. As the shadows lengthened and the day settled into itself, I wondered, calmly now, without bitterness, could recognition be its own kind of justice? And if so, what might still be possible now that they were finally seeing me again?
I came back in the afternoon. That mattered. The light was right, slanted and patient, the kind that only shows up when it wants to be remembered. It spilled across the floor just inside the doorway, stopping where it always had, as if it hadn't moved in all this time. I stood there with my hand on the frame, feeling the wood beneath my palm. The house recognized me before anyone else did. No one rushed me.
They'd left the door unlocked. That felt intentional. Not an invitation exactly, more like permission. I stepped inside slowly, letting the door close behind me with the same soft click I'd heard 1,000 times before. The air smelled familiar. Old wood, dust warmed by sun, a trace of soap that had settled into the walls years ago and never left. I hadn't realized how much I missed that smell. My shoes made sound on the floor this time, a low creak, then another. The boards answered me in the same places they always had. I smiled at that. The hallway looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had grown larger again. Either way, it felt right, lived in, honest. Sunlight lay across the floor in wide bands, highlighting the small imperfections, a scuff near the corner, a faint stain where water once spilled and no one ever bothered to fix. This house never needed to be perfect. It only needed to be true. I walked room to room without a plan. The living room first. The chair by the window was still there, turned just enough to catch the afternoon light. I ran my fingers along the armrest, feeling the smoothness worn in by years of use. The kitchen came next. The table stood exactly where it always had, the same small mark near the edge where someone once dropped a knife too hard, the same stretch of wall that caught the morning sun. I stood there for a long moment. This was where the word had been used. This was where silence had settled in afterward. I thought about how easily a place can hold pain without changing its shape, how the house had kept standing even when I felt myself shrinking inside it. On the counter, a stack of papers lay neatly arranged, not hidden, not tucked away. My name sat at the top, clear, unmistakable. I didn't touch them right away. I didn't need to. I moved toward the hallway that led to my old room. The door was open. Inside, the light pooled softly on the floor just as it used to in the late afternoon. The walls looked the same. The small nail holes where pictures once hung were still there, unfilled, like the room had been waiting. I stepped inside and rested my hand against the wall. It was cool, solid. It hadn't forgotten me. I thought about all the years I'd lived here, quietly carrying what needed to be carried, the schedules, the grief, the steady presence that made everything else possible. No one had written that down. No one had thought to. And yet the house remembered. I realized then how wrong the word burden had always been, how it never fit no matter how gently it was spoken. I hadn't been heavy. I had been strong. I had carried things so others wouldn't have to notice the weight. I sat on the edge of the bed, or where the bed used to be, and let the room settle around me. The house breathed softly, pipes ticking, wood shifting. I thought about my name, how it had been removed from places quietly, efficiently, and how it had found its way back, not through argument, not through anger, but through truth. Truth doesn't raise its voice. It corrects the record and waits. I was written back in now, on paper, in rooms, in memory. Not because I demanded it, but because it was always accurate. I wondered how many women had been erased this way, softly, kindly, with good intentions and closed doors. I wondered how many never found their way back. That thought stayed with me, not as bitterness, but as clarity. Before leaving, I walked back to the doorway and turned once more. The light had shifted slightly, climbing the wall where it always did. The floor held it for a moment longer before letting it go. I rested my hand on the frame again. I was never a burden, I said quietly, not to anyone else, but to myself. Just a woman who carried more than anyone noticed.
I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me. As I walked away, the house stayed standing, steady, whole, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the same. The truth had written my name back, and now, with nothing left to prove, I wondered what I would choose to carry next.